Only mode.
Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Peter Joyce with the Fish, Wildlife and Land branch of the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment will be talking about new directions in habitat mitigation, early experience and future opportunities. Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Stay tuned for upcoming Native Prairie Speaker Series webinars. Autumn Watkinson, a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta, will be doing a presentation about sage-grouse habitat restoration on November 29th at noon. On December 6th at noon, Jeff Keith with the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Centre will be presenting about data sharing. Details for both of these webinars will be posted on the PCAP website in the near future. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by Environment Canada and our presenting sponsors, Eco-Friendly Saskatchewan, Ranchers Stewardship Alliance Inc., and SaskTel. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by the Government of Saskatchewan. Just a reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard anytime during the presentation, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about our presenter. Peter Joyce is a strategic conservation specialist with the Fish and Wildlife Branch Ministry of Environment. Pete holds an interdisciplinary master's in natural resources management and a BSc in ecology from the University of Manitoba. His 20-plus years experience in wildlife and conservation program development and delivery includes time with Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Manitoba Wildlife Federation, and Agriculture Canada. And now I will turn it over to Peter. Can you hear us there?
Sure can.
And you should see something that says show my screen.
I am not seeing that, Caitlin.
Okay. Let's try that again. How about now?
I'm afraid I do not. There we go. All right, are you guys able to see my screen now?
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
Excellent. Okay. Afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Caitlin, for the invitation to speak today. As Caitlin said, I sit in the Fish, Wildlife and Lands branch with Ministry of Environment. I started working in the area of habitat mitigation some years back because our branch has an interest in managing development impacts on fish and wildlife habitat across Saskatchewan. So initially, my work in this area focused on development and testing of a tool to help non-ag industry proponents manage their impacts on wetlands. And based on some of that experience and feedback from industry and NGO partners, as well as having opportunities to apply the concepts in other situations, that work expanded and has grown over time. So while I recognize most of you are interested in the application of this to prairie conservation, I'll be touching on how the concepts have been applied in other habitat types too. I guess I'd like to stress too that what I've been working on are still just prototypes that are in development. So I'm really appreciative of the opportunity today to get your reaction and maybe hear some feedback on what we've done so far. At the end of the presentation, I'll have my email address up, and I know oftentimes in webinars, not everybody has time to ask questions they want to ask. So Very interested in hearing feedback by email if there is an opportunity on the webinar today. So in terms of an overview of why we're doing this, why we're developing guidelines and policy around this, it does respond to interest from industry and e-NGOs. Industry, by and large, does their best to avoid and minimize impacts of development, and would like to have options where there are simply cases where impacts are unavoidable. So in cases like, say, a mining project where minerals are in a specific place that have to be extracted from that specific place, there may be impacts that just can't be avoided through siting, for example. So we need to have the full range of options for offsets and so forth, and use the full suite of avoidance, minimization, and offset to try and manage effects. Getting clearer, more consistent standards in place kind of aligns our province with accepted practices across Canada and internationally. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're trying to be clear and consistent with industry proponents and partners, and try to apply those concepts to help us achieve responsible development. So this supports our work around moving to results-based regulation, and getting better, clearer standards in place maybe helps to move forward on risk avoidance, and perhaps helps to enable markets for conservation offsets and new market-based mechanisms to help us manage development effects and manage the challenges of growth that are connected to our current growth agenda. So, so that's kind of why we're in that game. I guess you know, I've worked in this area for a while, and it can be overwhelming. A system to broadly support habitat mitigation by all land users has a lot of elements that have to be in place. We recognize that Ministry of Environment is only one player in that. Participation by industry, by the conservation community, by qualified people or agents, potentially conservation agencies that act as service providers, are all needed for habitat mitigation schemes to operate effectively. So in Saskatchewan, it's pretty early days. We're just taking our first steps and trying to move the sticks a little bit. What I'm working on or going to talk about today are really just a couple of parts of what the bigger system is that we hopefully are going to get in place someday. And for government, it makes sense for us, I think, as standard setters to be starting to think about getting standards and principles in place to support habitat mitigation. Start thinking about an offset currency to support those situations where impacts are unavoidable and we need to consider offsets. So what is acceptable in that sense, and some guidance to maybe support avoidance of impacts and identify sensitive areas that are high risk and so on. So as I say again, what I've been working on are prototypes that are still in development. So as I go through this, I'll ask you to think about what I'm saying, and if you have feedback, I'm really interested in hearing it. So a core piece is a mitigation framework that we've been working on to set out the basic principles and key definitions and desired outcomes of mitigation, just to be clear and consistent about what that means, and kind of get the language in place for ourselves as well as for industry and others who are going to be working around this. It helps to clarify our expectations in terms of regulatory approvals and so on, and what's acceptable if we get in a situation where offsets are required. So what kind of makes the grade if you're speaking in an environmental compliance kind of a context. And it also helps us in terms of giving us a foundation for devising guidelines, planning tools, things like that, that are going to support good management of development impacts. One thing that I guess I've taken away from some of the background research and so on that I've done around this is that where mitigation and offset schemes have become well established and fairly stable, and where markets have developed and so on for offsets, it's usually because there's government policies or regulations in place that have helped to create the right conditions for those things to develop. So again, we're not the only players in this. It's it's a system that requires many players, industry, NGOs, and others in the conservation community to work with us and work around this. But we do have a piece to play, and standard setting is maybe one of those key areas. Oops. There we go. So I think everyone that's in attendance is probably already familiar with the general concepts and so on. I'm not going to delve into it a whole lot, but I'll just recap. So mitigation is a sort of a stepwise process of avoidance, minimization, and compensation to manage development impacts. We want to avoid, minimize, offset. Not just offset, not just run right to offset, but do our work to try to apply all three of those steps. The greatest environmental benefits are arguably maybe accomplished from impact avoidance, if through good siting and planning. Industry proponents can consider different sites or different technologies to avoid effects. That's a real win if you can avoid that impact altogether. And I think in the context of Prairie, that's particularly relevant. That Prairie is very hard to recreate. So probably the best outcome is if one can plan to avoid impacts in the first place, recognizing that that's probably not practical in 100% of cases, but that we definitely want to start there and do our best to try and avoid as far as possible. The compensation part gets a lot of attention. The offsetting part in the approaches from other jurisdictions and the direction we're heading. We're seeing that as a necessary option, but an option of last resort. After avoidance and minimization have been exhausted, and you're at a place where there's residual impacts. Okay, you're potentially going to look at offsets. And what I mean by offsets, or maybe there's some who are not familiar, it's basically an action, usually in an alternate location from a project development site, that makes up for unavoidable impacts by restoring or enhancing habitat. We felt it was important to articulate in a general way what the desired outcomes of mitigation are, so we're clear around that. Like I've said already, it's around avoiding sensitive areas through good siting, using best practices to minimize operational impacts as far as possible, offsetting residual effects, including landscape disturbance and fragmentation effects. We sometimes forget that it's not just the stuff that's lost outright, but there's also those other softer effects that are important. And then the biggie that's forgotten in a lot of other jurisdictions, and one of the areas that's often criticized by folks who are not huge fans of mitigation approaches, is forgetting to monitor and track the outcomes of the offsetting actions or other actions that are put in place to manage development effects. There's cases in the U.S., for example, where compensation wetlands are put in place, and nobody's really keeping tabs on those, and another developer may come along and actually take out a compensation wetland. And so those kinds of things need to be managed. We need to monitor to prove that a restoration project has been successful, and have a contingency plan to make sure if things don't go as we've planned, that we've got a backup option. So we've devised some draft principles in association with this mitigation framework. Again, not reinventing the wheel, not rocket science really, but trying to be clear about what the expectations are. Ideally, we'd plan early to effectively avoid. I think in the past, perhaps things move down the planning path quite far before environmental considerations are taken into account. If you start early, you optimize your opportunities to avoid environmentally risky areas and potentially minimize or eliminate effects. So we want to see that happening early on, and hopefully from our side provide some support and some information that's going to help industry proponents to avoid environmentally risky areas more readily. We want to see folks accounting for ecological values and risks, and that's built into some of the early tools that we're working on that I'll talk about in a minute. But recognizing that not all habitat is created equal. Some is extremely sensitive habitat, some is extremely high value for species, and we need to consider those things in terms of what an appropriate offset might be, for example, and what's acceptable from maybe a planning perspective. If there's an extreme risk area, ideally we'd stay away from that and choose to develop, if we have the option, in a place that's lower risk. We want to see folks factoring in time lags and uncertainties. So, for example, if there's an offset project required, not waiting 10 years to get it done because there's that loss of function that occurs over time, but factoring that in, trying to do offsets where they're necessary in as short a time frame as possible, and then where there are lags, accounting for those and kind of building it into the calculation. Kind of a strong feeling that maintaining health and integrity of natural systems is important in this. Not using artificial kinds of mechanisms or substitutes, and this one came out of some discussions with a proponent that was working in the north, and had said, well, we were kicking around different options. Could we do this versus that? And it was a discussion around using particular plant species in a reclamation project. Something that's quick and easy to grow is not necessarily the right thing to use. You want to see native species and hopefully restoration of systems that maintain sort of the health and integrity of that site. So trying to be clear around that. As I said earlier, compensating is a last resort, and then doing it deliberately and in a way that is additional in the same sense that we talk about around carbon offsets, where there's incremental benefit from the restoration action. It's not just something that's being done anyway as a business as usual kind of activity. It's incremental and is a meaningful and deliberate offset. We want to see science-based measures to clearly quantify the effects and equivalency of offsets. And the last one is around polluter pays, or industry that's responsible for an impact is also responsible for managing that impact. So being clear about that applies. So we've applied this thinking in several different ways over the last few years. I mentioned earlier that initially some of this work was focused around wetlands and a wetland mitigation guide. There's been about 4 test sites that have been worked on over the last while around wetlands. We've got a prairie mitigation guide that really arose as a result of a wetland test case where a proponent had a need to also offset for unavoidable effects on prairie. And I'll talk a little bit later about a little bit of a case study that we did with Sask Power to try and test an early guideline that we're working on around that. We also worked with a peat company in east central Saskatchewan up around Carrot River that was going to do a project that would impact caribou habitat, and they took some of the principles and this formula-based approach that we've been working on to help with planning for offset projects and applied it to caribou habitat. I'm not going to get into that in a bunch of detail because it's not really your guys' key interest, but it was an interesting application that we learned lessons from. And then we've also done some work around trying to support and encourage avoidance. Sask Power had approached the ministry and talked with us about providing some siting guidance to identify higher risk areas for wind energy development. And so we've devised a wind siting guideline that identifies areas that are higher versus lower risk with a view to trying to put wind energy development in places that are economic from a wind energy standpoint, but hopefully lower risk from an environmental risk standpoint. So the slide that I have up right now shows where some of those mitigation test case sites are located. For a little bit of a backstory, most of the proponents we worked with were already required to offset under our Environmental Assessment Act, and they were offered the draft mitigation guide for consideration as something that was a tool that could help them to develop a comp. So we worked with those guys. They in turn reached out to some NGO partners to work with them as offset providers and devised compensatory mitigation projects to manage their unavoidable impact. I won't get into the details of each of those projects, but we had a couple of highways projects that impacted wetlands. I mentioned the Pasqua Bog project already. Poplar River Mine was expanding a coal pit and was impacting some wetlands and needed to do an off of the mitigation tool that we've been been devising to help them to build that. And then the last one there, K+S pod, it started out small. There was a camp they were developing that was going to impact the environmental manager that I was dealing with there said, hey, this tool could have application to our whole project where, our tailings management area and everything else is going to be located. Could we apply it more broadly? So we said, sure, we worked through that. And they liked the formula-based approach that was built into that tool. I said, well, gee, could we adapt this for Prairie? And that was kind of the genesis of a Prairie tool that I'll talk about further in a minute. But essentially, the feedback on these test cases from industry and the NGOs has been pretty positive. We've got some great feedback on where we can improve the tools, but I think some real strengths in terms of helping industry manage their effects, in terms of recognizing the role of NGOs and people in the conservation community to help with providing offsets, which are not really, it's not really the business of a mining company to say, do a wetland offset or Ministry of Highways to do a wetland offset. It's more so something where you bring in a hired gun that's got expertise in that area and can maybe help you out there. So that value, I think, was recognized by us and by the industry partners in this. So again, it's not a Ministry of Environment says kind of thing here. It's something where we're a player along with industry and others to try and make something like this go. One big take home from our experience was that there was a real desire from, I think, all our partners to have more clarity on what our expectations are as a ministry around mitigation and our policy around that. So that actually was part of the reason that we did the work around a mitigation framework, was to get that clarity and articulate what those expectations are. So as we move along with this stuff, the work is kind of leading us in directions that we maybe didn't anticipate initially, and it's been great. We're getting some really great guidance and input from people outside the ministry. So I mentioned one of the pieces we worked on was a wildlife siting guideline for wind energy projects. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail about this because, again, it's perhaps not something that's of extreme interest to you guys. One point I will make is that the guidance does state that there's a strong recommendation to avoid developing wind energy projects on native prairie because they are such a high conservation priority, and sites that are critical habitat for species at risk and so on were identified in the siting guidance as higher risk sites. So there's some relevance to prairie conservation here in trying to direct development to areas that are perhaps lower risk, maybe seeded croplands, perennial, tame perennial cover, or other sites, rather than stuff that's very high value from a conservation perspective. So I've talked a bit about the wetland mitigation guides in the context of some of the pilot projects we've done. We started with a wetland mitigation guide with the intent to help proponents achieve compliance and enhance their environmental performance. It includes guidance on avoidance and minimization, very brief, but the big part of it is kind of a weighted area approach, a formula-based approach for calculating what an appropriate offset or compensatory mitigation plan might be. Like I've said before, I'll stress again, these are still draft. they're still in development, and they're not quote unquote policy at this point. So I don't have time to kind of get in the weeds today and tell you about the details of those tools, but just as a way to try to give you a bit of an overview, here's kind of what they look like. I mean, most of you probably are familiar with fixed ratio approaches where you compensate at a rate of 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. The tendency is to try to replace like with like, which can be pretty subjective and often difficult to achieve because you maybe can't find exactly that same kind of habitat that's available to secure in a way that's acceptable or what have you. It's kind of a coarse instrument, and it doesn't account for functional impacts and values, differences in value of different patches of habitat. So we ended up going with a weighted area formula that's based on a model that's used in the US quite extensively, and it basically estimates functional loss and gain from at the development site and at an offset site using a currency called service hectares, which is basically a weighted value / area kind of a quantity. It tends to provide a better assessment or estimate of impacts and losses, but it is a little more complicated, and sometimes folks' eyes glass over because there's expressions in there that look like math, and it's kind of confusing at first, but once you sit down and work with it, it's proving to be a fairly useful currency. We're hopeful that this could be a basis as we move forward with some of this mitigation stuff to use in mitigation banking and other offset schemes. The way the thing is built, we've tried to keep it fairly flexible so that different offset options can be considered, and they're weighted accordingly. So things that tend to have greater permanence, like say a long-term agreement versus a short-term agreement on a piece of offset habitat, the longer-term agreement would tend to have more weight because it's going to be there longer and provide functional value longer. Generally, the value multipliers on the impact or debit side of the equation are similar or the same as the multipliers on the credit or offset side of the calculation. And that's there for a reason. It's to give industry proponents credit for trying to choose the best offset project that they can that provides the most value from an ecological function standpoint. And then, as I say, different offset kinds of approaches, whether you restore habitat or enhance habitat or what have you, have different weights attached to them based on the estimate of their relative value from an ecological standpoint. So the one thing here that I'd like you to notice is that the idea that debits need to equal credits in the calculation. So if you have a functional impact at a development site, and with the formula you assess the impact based on the functional area lost and the value of that habitat. Say you've lost 10 service hectare debits on the development side, you need to compensate with 10 service hectare credits on the offset side, and use that formula to help you assess what the relative value of the different actions are on your offset side. So one of the things that's kind of shaken out of the work on this so far is that the formula-based approach, although it's a tiny bit more complicated, there's some real values to it. It encourages high-value offsets, like I mentioned. So the idea here is this graphic is an attempt to show that on the impact side, if one is to say impact an area and keep your footprint as small as possible and choose to site your project in a place where ecological value is low, you should be able to get away with doing generating fewer impact debits, and your compensation requirement would be lower. So it encourages avoidance of high risk areas, and it encourages proponents to keep their footprint as small as they can. On the offset side, the effect of the formula is to get proponents to do the highest value project they can, so choose the best habitat or the best site from an ecological standpoint, and hopefully they won't have to do quite so much of it. So it's a flexible approach. It's not fixed where it's always 3-to-1 or always 2-to-1. It depends on how good is the habitat, and that the value metrics help proponents to estimate that. So long-winded story shorter, the approach, we think, incentivizes avoidance and minimization, especially of critical habitat and critical areas. And where impacts are unavoidable, it encourages proponents to develop their projects at sites of lower ecological value and to seek higher value offset projects in return. And there's an economic incentive for industry proponents to do that. Oops, sorry about that. So the process is fairly straightforward. Generally, the habitat impact debit calculation is done first. Proponents think about their options in terms of a compensatory project and what the credits of those different options might be. So are they sufficient to offset the impact? There's a kind of a verification of no net loss of function, and eventually implementation and monitoring of the project. So I guess I wanted to come back around to the Prairie Guide because I know that's probably of most interest to this group. I mentioned the backstory around this with K+S Potash. I think they deserve a lot of credit here, along with Nature Conservancy and Can North Consultants, who kind of took the initiative to adapt a tool that was designed for wetlands and apply it to prairie. And they did a pretty good job of it. We were there to provide some input and advice along the way, but mostly these guys kind of took that ball and ran with it. What they came up with was more so a formula in a spreadsheet. It wasn't a guide. So we needed to develop that a little bit further to make it something that another proponent could pick up and use. So we hired a contractor, Jason Unrow. Some of you guys might know him. He was a grad student working in the Southeast on oil and gas impacts on prairie songbirds. Jason did the work for us to draft a guidance and build on the good work that K+S, NCC, and Can North had done. Subsequently, we took that product, and Sask Power we'd been talking a little bit with them about offsets, and obviously we had the engagement with Sask Power around the wind energy siting guidance, and the folks at Sask Power stepped up and made a few dollars available to assess impacts along a transmission line redevelopment between Pasqua and Swift Current to get a sense of, well, what could an offset look like if we were to do something like this voluntarily. They weren't encouraged as part of an EA or anything like that to do that. Basically took the draft tool and test drove it, and then did some assessment with NCC about, well, what would that look like in terms of a project, and what might that cost. So we got some great feedback from that. It identified some weaknesses in the product that we need to work on further. But it was a great real world test of our first cut at the thing, and is going to kind of shape how we move forward with it. So as it sits right now, the Prairie Guide is kind of organized into a few main sections. There's a intro and policy overview, which kind of touches on the basic standards and principles stuff that I was talking about earlier. There's some guidance on avoidance and minimization. Real stress in this guideline that Prairie is, I don't want to say irreplaceable, but it's darn near irreplaceable. It's pretty hard to recreate. It's going to take many, many, many years to achieve the same species diversity and function that exists in a native unbroken site. The guide, as in other products like the Wetland Guide, lays out a process to assess impact debits and offset credits using this weighted area formula. Again, using multipliers that try to capture value from a prairie standpoint. So things like connectivity, are there species at risk present, sort of qualities like that. And then it also provides examples of quote unquote acceptable offset approaches. Things like restoration of native prairie degraded by development. So it might be that you restore linear features within a block of native prairie, or a well pad that has been improperly reclaimed, or some such. Maybe functional enhancement of existing native prairie by altering land use practice, or changing the management regime in some fashion. And lastly, perhaps through planted native cover, particularly where it might connect patches of existing native and increase connectivity between those two. So that's kind of the main elements of it. The feedback so far on it, sort of where the areas for improvement are. The challenge on a couple of things there, I think, justifiably. We need to strengthen the rationale around, why the multiplier quantities are what they are. So we've got a little bit more work to clarify that, and maybe add some science and some references to it. The examples that were given in the guide are quite oil and gas focused, partly just because of Jason's background and experience. So we want to broaden that a little bit so the context is relevant to a range of development interests. And we need to just simplify and condense the thing. It's pretty weighty, and we need to make it a little tighter and brighter. We need to clarify in there kind of what the application and scope of the guide is. When does it apply under the EA Act, for example? At this stage, we've been saying these guidances, the Wetland Guide and the Prairie Guide, are more or less voluntary tools. So when a proponent has a need to offset or to pick the thing up and use it, it's available. But we have had cases where a proponent has said, yeah, I'm going to offset, and they go, gee, how do I do that? And we've got this tool that we can make available, and they've maybe committed to do that offsetting under an EA process, for example. We've got this tool they can pick up and use. So it's voluntary, except when it's not, I guess, to be even more vague. Um, I think we need to do some more work to kind of formalize these things as standards, and in turn, that's going to help proponents include it or consider it more fully in their planning. So this is part of the evolution of, I think, mitigation policy in the province, that we need to be clear about what the expectations are. So it's along the same lines as feedback we got on some of our earlier casework. And last but not least, that generally it has the potential to be a worthwhile and useful piece that I think industry and NGOs are seeing some value in. So where we're headed, we want to try and move down the path of formalizing the adoption of the mitigation framework standards and principles in our ministry. That's something we want to do in collaboration with industry and NGOs and others. Not something we want to force down anybody's throat, but trying to meet that suggestion that we got from our casework that we need to be clearer about this. Looking to test, refine, and finalize the guidance and materials we've been working on with stakeholder input. Think further about what other sort of system requirements are there for growing this to include offsets and offset banks as compliance mechanisms, and connecting this to our regulatory process, so that if a proponent wants to include compensatory mitigation as part of their mitigation plan in, say, an EA context, that they can do so, and there's the infrastructure in place within the ministry that the proponent has the assurance that the credits will count for something if they're doing an offset, and we have the assurance that the offset requirement is being met in a fulsome kind of a way, and that the environmental management kind of makes the grade. We've still got some more thinking to do about sort of new regs and policies to institutionalize this. That's something, again, that I think we're looking out a little bit for input and comment. Things that maybe you guys, I'd be interested in you guys on the phone and online to consider. I guess we're thinking about kind of managing the tension between making avoidance of impact happen. It's quite desirable, but there's a market incentive for creating systems for offsets, and potentially offsets could provide revenue to support habitat conservation activities, perhaps to go to land managers who are prepared to provide services that would qualify as offsets. So how do we avoid kind of the perverse incentive problem, so that we're not rushing to offset before we've exhausted all the options to avoid? We need to think about other policies and sort of policy coherence in this. So, for example, there's a SARA permitting policy that came out not too long ago. We have to think about how we're going to harmonize with that, how this is going to tie to mitigating for potential impacts on critical habitat, and that our standards are coherent there. We also need to think hard, again, about that problem. Native prairie, in my head, is kind of unique. It takes a long time to come back from being converted or disturbed. So how do we satisfy the additionality requirements when nobody's making any more native prairie anymore? I've got this little teeter-totter thing to try and illustrate that perhaps the solution is, in ganging together some small things that kind of stitch the prairie fabric back together as a means to improve overall function. And perhaps that is one avenue to try and tackle that incrementality problem and, getting to prairie systems that are more intact and more highly functional than what was there before. It's not as easy to go out and restore a chunk of prairie as it is to say restore a chunk of wetland to offset a chunk that's lost as a result of, say, a gravel pit or a well pad development or a road. So very interested in people's thoughts or comments around that. I'd mentioned that there's some opportunities in the title of the presentation and wanted to touch on that very quickly. There is going to be a need, I think, as this evolves for service providers who can help with providing offsets, be they landowners, be they NGOs, be they cattlemen's groups, you name it, to help out with this. This isn't about the ministry doing everything. This is a conservation community and industry community kind of an undertaking, I think. We're going to need qualified agents who know how to use the tools and work with this stuff. I think there are roles potentially for people in the stewardship community to also act as extension agents by saying, you could maybe prevent here and save yourself some cost. And then when it comes time to offset, here's how you might go about that. So it's kind of making this more of a business standard over time and hopefully getting everybody pulling the oars together to kind of move it along. And on an ongoing basis, this is not going to happen overnight. We need to get input from all stakeholders around what these tools and approaches are going to look like and make them the best that we can. So folks use them and get value from them, and it leads to the kinds of outcomes that we're after. So that's pretty well all I had to say. I wanted to leave a bit of time for questions and hopefully get a few comments. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. That was a really great presentation. If any of our listeners in the audience today have any questions, you're welcome to type that into the question section of the webinar dashboard. And I just wanted to remind everyone that when you leave this presentation, you will get a quick questionnaire. And if you don't mind filling it out, it'll just take a minute, and that helps us with our funding for webinars that we can keep this going in the future. It doesn't look like we have any questions at the moment, so I just wanted to remind all of our listeners that you can check out upcoming PCAP events. Just go to the PCAP website, www.pcap-sk.org, and click on Communications and then Native Prairie Speaker Series. I also want to remind our audience that we do have the Native Prairie Restoration and Reclamation Workshop coming out, and you can check that out on the PCAP website. It looks like we have a listener who has a question, and this is from a listener named Jarrett. Is habitat banking going to be considered as part of the mitigation framework?
Thanks for the question, Jarrett. At this point in the game, we're trying to get our feet under us and get the basic standards around mitigation, what it is, the basic definitions, and the basic outcomes in place. I think the longer view is to get to banking in some fashion. Again, I'm a working official in government. The big decisions around what the framework looks like exactly goes to the elected officials. So I think we're going to cross that bridge eventually, and what it looks like is partly up to stakeholders in our conservation community and our industry community. I suspect we're heading there, but it's not immediately going to be part of the mitigation framework right at this time.
Thank you, Peter. A listener named Katie would like to know if the prairie and wetland mitigation guides are publicly available yet.
They aren't published yet. We need to go through a ministry approval process before that occurs. I have shared some of that material on a limited basis with folks who have interest in using it and applying it to specific projects as a way to get feedback on the tools. So if folks are interested for that kind of purpose, by all means get in touch. For broader consumption, stay tuned, and as soon as we can release them, we are looking forward to doing that.
Thank you, Peter. I just wanted to let all of our listeners know that this presentation has been recorded and will be available on the PCAP YouTube channel. And you can also find a PDF of the slides if you look at the handout section on the webinar dashboard. We do have a question, Peter, from a listener named Glenda. Neighboring regulators in Alberta have proposed that native prairie should include landscapes with as little as 30% native species. Does the draft framework provide guidance on what qualifies as native prairie?
Yeah, thanks, Glenda. Great question. It does. That's one of the things that the guidance, I think, offers is some clarity and definitions around those kinds of things. I believe we went with a definition that evolved from our work on the Crown Land Ecological Assessment Tool, and we're seeing 50 or greater native species, and native includes embedded elements like shrub habitats and so on. Again, interested in response from people when the thing is finally released on whether that looks right or whether it's practical for use in a field setting.
Thank you, Peter. A listener named Dina would like to know, would it be possible in the future to do a case study to work through the formulas/policies in action?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we tried to do that with the wetland piece. We've been working on the wetland mitigation guide for a longer period of time than the prairie mitigation guide. We've done one, I wouldn't call it a tabletop exercise. It was more than that. The Saskatchewan work that I referred to was to take the draft tool, the draft prairie mitigation guide tool, and test it out on a line redevelopment project. So Saskatchewan contracted a consultant to go out on the land, assess what prairie was present, and use the tool to assess potential impact. And then they engaged Nature Conservancy to take that information and estimate what an appropriate offset would look like and what the approximate cost would be, and so on. So there's been some of that work done, but I'm a believer in doing a substantial amount of it and learning those lessons rather than sort of drafting something and putting it out in the world for everyone to use before we test it out and get it right. So yeah, definitely interest in doing more of that kind of work.
Great, thank you, Peter. A listener named Andrew would like to know, in regards to the compensation matrix, have definitions for large versus small areas have been defined?
Good question. Is the matrix that's being referred to? I'm not totally clear on the question, so I'll just take a stab.
The compensation matrix have definitions for large versus small areas been defined.
Right. So in the Prairie Mitigation Guide, proponents assess the area of impact, direct impact, so outright loss of habitat, and they'll assess the area of that impact. So the assumption is that 100% of function is lost in areas where, say, prairie habitat is completely lost due to conversion to some other form, like cultivation or if it's paved over or something like that. Where softer impacts are in place, like if there's, say, a remnant patch that has a road going next to it, the reach of that impact is assessed using a matrix that looks at the frequency and intensity of effect on those remnant bits. So the area is included in that, as well as the level of functional loss, and that's kind of a subjective judgment that the user of the guide has to make in order to assess that effect. I don't know if that answers the question exactly.
I think so. Andrew, if you're still there, oh yes, he replied it does. Perfect. Thank you very much, Peter. It doesn't look like we have any more questions at the moment. So I just wanted to take a minute to thank our sponsors again. And our presenting sponsors today are Eco-Friendly Sask, SaskTel, Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, Inc., Environment and Climate Change Canada. An in-kind support for today's presentation has been provided by the Government of Saskatchewan. Since we don't have any more questions coming in, I'd like to thank all of our listeners for tuning in to our webinar. And thank you, Peter, for the great presentation. And if you're looking for other presentations, please feel free to check out the PCAP website. So thank you all very much for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day. And thank you, Peter.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Just a parting word, if folks have other comments or questions, feel free to email.
Great, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.